Right. Welcome to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on social media and use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices. Our main item of business this afternoon is a discussion on community land trusts and cooperative housing. As part of this investigation, the committee has published a call for evidence, which is open to all who'd like to respond, but we'd particularly welcome submissions from housing cooperatives, community land trusts, local authorities, housing associations, developers, policy and advocacy groups or researchers, think tanks and academics. Please visit our website for more information. Before we begin, we have a few items of business. Can I now ask our clerk, Diane Richards, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence have been received.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask... okay. And ask if members have any other interests to declare?
Noted.
Noted and no.
Okay. Can we note the committee's membership, chairing arrangements and terms of reference, and the standing delegations of authority to me as chair, as agreed by the London Assembly on 10th of May 2024? Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of February 2024?
Agreed.
Can we note the completed and closed actions arising from previous meetings?
Noted.
Can we note the action taken by the former chair under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members to agree the London's Temporary Accommodation Emergency Report, the Young Londoners Access to Home Ownership Report, and the letter to the Mayor of London regarding the financial viability of the housing sector? Great. So that brings us to our main item of business, community land trusts and cooperative housing. Please can I welcome our first panel of guests. We have, I'll go from right to left, Tom Chance, who is the Chief Executive of the Community Land Trust Network, Niall Mulholland, Executive Member of the London Federation of Housing Co-operatives, Bernadette Marjoram, Board Member of Meridian Home Start, and Fatimatu Mohamed, Secretary at Gida Housing Co-operative. So welcome to you all. So I will take the first few questions and then hand over to my colleagues on the panel. So my first one is to you, Tom. Oh, apologies. It is not to you. Well, it is to you. It's a different question. How much community-led housing does London need to deliver or does deliver compared to other parts of England? And this is for Niall as well. Are there unique challenges for community-led housing groups in London compared to other parts of England? So we'll start with Tom and then move over to you, Niall.
Thank you, Chair. Well, it's changed over the years. There's certainly a period that Niall might refer to in the 1970s and 80s when London was one of the centres of cooperative house building in the UK, and it still has one of the largest stocks of cooperative housing of any city in the UK. In the last 10 or 15 years, that's really changed, and certainly in the community land trust world, the majority of activity has been elsewhere. There's been particular progress in rural parts, but also other cities like Bristol or Liverpool, and CLTs have really struggled to take off in London. I give two reasons for that. One is simply if you're trying to build something yourself, London is a very expensive and challenging place to develop, and CLTs have tended to only manage to get a little sort of fingerhold in very difficult small sites with big viability challenges where it's very hard to pull off the kind of affordability aspirations that communities have. And then in the more mainstream forms of development, there has been less uptake or interest from public authorities in inserting or helping CLTs and communities to be part of developments in the way that we've seen in other parts of the country. And the vast majority of development of CLT housing has been in partnership with housing associations and private developers and councils elsewhere, but we just haven't seen that take off to the same extent in London.
Yeah, I would concord with those points. There's around 300 housing co-ops in London of different types. The vast majority of them were created in the period of the 60s, 70s and 1980s. And the fully mutual type of housing co-op, of which I'm a member of, just not too far from here in Forest Gate, it was helped greatly by the Housing Association grant that existed. That was got rid of in the early 1990s. So it's been a struggle since, because obviously land costs have risen dramatically, and that is the main problem we face. I mean, there are different types of housing, co-ops, co-housing, and so on, but I think the fundamental problem they all face is the issue of grants, of land value costs, and the whole complicated process as it is now getting started to set up a housing co-op.
Thank you both. So my next question is also to Fatimatu, but I'll ask the two of you as well. So how do community land trusts and housing co-ops ensure that the allocations process is fair and that the resident population is diverse and reflective of the local community? And just by way of background, we had a site visit as part of this investigation, and this was a topic that came up on that visit. So I just wondered if I could maybe start with Fatimatu and then work the other way.
For Gida Housing Cooperative, though we cannot speak to the whole sector, we can speak to the Tottenham area. Our affordability was set by the GLA after there was campaign from STAR, who is another CLT. And the properties are being built by Peabody, and one of the conditions that STAR fought for was that there are allocated homes for London Live and Rent, which fortunately has come to fruition, and it provides greater flexibility for private renting individuals to have secured homes. In terms of the allocation, we have an open membership, so anyone can actually sign up as long as they meet the criteria, and you just have to pay £1. In terms of the criteria for, sorry, as long as you meet the income eligibility and you are within the Tottenham area, you are fine to sign up for the Gida Housing Cooperative. Gida essentially aims to provide homes for Black and ethnically minoritized communities. So we really emphasize that. And with that, we hope that it would garner individuals within that Black and ethnically minoritized communities, but we are not closed for all.
You said that there's an income, the allocation is partly based on income. Do you do that similar to the way that council housing, your income assessment, is that similar to other types of non-mainstream housing? So just thinking about, if you're applying to be a council tenant, there's a certain thing that you have to meet. If you're applying for shared ownership, there's certain criteria you need to meet. How does yours work?
It will be the same, but of course it's not the same as the council one, because I believe that will be lower, because London Live and Rent is 80% of private rent. So it does mean the threshold, you do have to make a bit more. Though this is only our first set of allocated homes, we hope to expand and find other opportunities that would permit us to provide lower rent for individuals. But yeah.
Can I just ask the other two and then we'll come back to you? Okay, thank you. Niall and then Tom, please.
Yeah, allocations is obviously a key part of housing co-ops, but we're a very small sector of the social housing, less than 1% across the country. So obviously we're not in any position to help resolve the deep housing crisis, but each housing co-op might have its own slight variations on how it conducts allocations. Very often, because of grants we've had in the past from local authorities, we have to be involved in a process of taking some of the allocations from the council in different boroughs. But generally speaking, it's very similar, I think, to how people go onto the waiting lists and are allocated in housing in local authorities. The same sort of point system, housing need, and so on. But I think a big difference is that we also put a lot of emphasis on cooperability, on the ability of people to understand what a housing co-op is, that they're expected to enjoy a lot of the rights from housing co-ops, and but also to be involved in the running of a housing co-op at some level. So it does take a certain amount of commitment or understanding that that's the case, and if they can bring particular skills to a housing co-op, that's all the better. And also we put emphasis on the fact that if they do get involved in a housing co-op, they can learn lots of new skills like budgeting and even small repairs, dealing with finances and so on. So there's a bit of an overlap with how it's done in local authorities, but we have our own special way of taking people in.
So community land trusts are a bit different to housing co-ops in this respect. Community land trusts exist to meet the social and economic needs of their local community, which can include non-housing stuff as well as housing, and their allocations are then done on a fair basis to people in housing need in their area. CLTs in London, about two-thirds of the housing stock of CLTs is social rent and is just provided with nomination rights to councils, like any other social housing provider. The bulk of that is in the case of Walterton Elgin Community Homes, which is a CLT that was transferred from the council to community hands in 1992. They've subsequently redeveloped that estate. They built more homes in it. They built community facilities, a nursery, other needs for their community within their estate. The low-cost home ownership homes, such as some of those you, for example, visited with London CLT scheme in Sydenham, will just be allocated in a similar way to shared ownership, so to people within the eligible income bracket. And often communities are really motivated to try to drive that within that income bracket to meet at the lower end of it and then to hold it there. So there's an emphasis not just on the initial sales to people within a certain income bracket, but making sure that resales are also affordable to people on those lower incomes, which has been a big problem with shared ownership, which, you know, you build it the first time and it goes to a nurse, and then the second time it gets sold, it's sold to the doctor, and the third time to somebody, well, a doctor couldn't afford it. So the purpose of this is to provide homes that are permanently affordable to the range of incomes within the local area. Nationally, about 80% of CLT homes have been social rent because that's where the major need is. And in London, it's not quite been that proportion simply because of viability issues. You need more grant in order to develop these sites and be able to get more social rent on it.
Is it always a requirement for someone to be a member of the CLT home in order to apply for that home?
It's never a requirement, or it's very rarely a requirement for CLTs. In some cases, like London CLT, they'll do it with their home ownership products. For the social rent homes, no, you'll just be allocated through the normal list. There will often be in some cases, in other parts of the country, there might be more of a local occupancy criterion, like desiring more of a clear local connection. And they might also look to then involve you more in the life and the running and the management of the thing, but it's optional, and ultimately the allocation is based on need.
Okay, and is Niall, could the same be same for housing cooperatives? You don't have to be a member of the cooperative, or is that possible?
You can apply to go on the waiting list as long as you fulfil the points and you have a genuine housing need. And then it depends on how each co-op wants to do it, but ultimately, to be a tenant, you have to be a member. To be a member, you have to be a tenant.
You have to be a member.
So that's how in particular our housing co-op works. But there are other housing co-ops that have members who don't live in the co-op, who like to help out and part of the wider co-op, but they're not actual tenants. Yeah. But from a legal point of view, and we have to get advice at times on this, it's far better that once people are voted in as members, that they are tenants become members.
So how do you guarantee that the application process is fair, open, easy? How's all that done?
Well, each co-op should have a proper policies and code of conduct and so on, and should be rigorous. And very often a management committee which is elected will have a subcommittee which is an allocations committee, and it will deal with the waiting list and bring proposals having met those who want to go on the waiting list, met them usually in their home where they are at the present time to make sure that there is a housing need, and then they will report that back to the management committee, and the management committee will put together a waiting list. And then from that waiting list, say if a one bed comes up, that would only apply to some of the people who are on the waiting list, because many others may want a 2 or 3 bed. So then there would be a process of selecting people who seem most cooperable from that process. But then, like for example, in my housing co-op, you have to go through 3 meetings. You have to attend 3 general meetings of the co-op, which take place quarterly, before you can become a full member.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So this is to all of you, and if you don't have an answer, then don't worry. But feel free not to answer, rather. Regarding race, sex, and income, how do your allocations processes ensure that the resident population is diverse and reflective of the local community? Because I suppose one concern that I don't speak for others, but one concern I had on our visit was that people were hearing about the opportunity by word of mouth only, which is, I think, unlike many other housing products out there. And so if you kind of don't know or your friends are not involved in this, you wouldn't know that there is an opportunity to be part of this really unique but important type of accommodation. So how do you kind of mitigate that in your allocations processes? So I don't know whether we want to start with Tom first, and then we'll go this way.
Sure. So for social or affordable rent properties, it will just be done through the normal allocations process. So if you're on the register with the council, like it's the same as if you're going to a housing association or a council property. With low-cost home ownership products, actually it's an interesting question I don't know the answer to, is to the extent to which these are available on the marketing websites for things like shared ownership and other schemes. I think community CLTs put a lot of effort into trying to promote the availability of these homes within their local community, and often have very good links within to their local community. For us, if I can turn your question round, given the purpose of the Community Land Trust is to organise the wider community, not the residents, or not primarily the residents, our emphasis has been on also how do the people involved with the CLT who are making the decisions about what's built, what tenures you have, what do they look like, how are those people involved, and how is that a representative group of people? And I'm really delighted to have Fatima from Gida here, because Gida emerged from a Community Land Trust campaign around a site in Tottenham, which was particularly exercised by the lack of housing options for black and minority ethnic people within a community, and the disproportionate impact on those communities from housing policy in that area. And we funded various CLTs around London and elsewhere in the UK to really focus on that, the community outreach part of it and the organising part of it, to try to identify which of the communities and which of the individuals who are being marginalised by this housing system, who could benefit from more power in that housing system, who could benefit from actually being an agent in delivering housing and managing housing, and not just in meeting their own housing need, but having an active role in that. And so there's been a real interest in areas like LGBT housing, in the lack of housing options for particularly black Londoners, and similarly in other parts of the country. And I think it's a really underexplored area, or an area where we would love to do much more, but is really under-resourced, because we tend to put grant into the housing unit, but not into the community and the process behind it. Okay. So it's something we're very aware of, and we're very proud of the strong history of anti-racist organising within the CLT movement internationally. So it's started in the civil rights movement in the United States. That's kind of inherent to the concept of it, is to empower the diverse communities. Before
I move on, I think that is very reassuring. But I guess my very direct point or question is how are you, Gary? So we're putting aside the homes for rent, but the homes for sale, that they don't exclude the people, that they are equally accessible to people. So I appreciate that in the method is as much part of CLT's approach as the outcome. But I would want reassurance of how to make sure that those homes, the people that get to live in them, are not all white middle class people who know somebody who's on the co-op or the CLT, to be blunt.
Yes.
Sorry. No, but I think it's an important point, and it is something which I would like us as a committee to be able to properly address in our recommendations about how we can help your sector overcome that, if that is an issue.
Yep.
And so that was really, I think, the nub of the question. But we'll come back to you, and then we'll allow everybody else to answer. Apologies.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a slightly unfair characterisation of the residents of the two schemes you've visited.
No, I know. I'm just being polemical. This is not based just on that. So I'm a Labour and Co-op Assembly member, as are the others in my group, and so I'm aware of housing cooperative movements, and there's pluses and minuses. And this is feedback that I have received beyond this scrutiny, well before this scrutiny. So it's just something which, if that is wrong, then it's really helpful to know why that's wrong, and where, if that's not quite the case, then how to fill that so that there is equal access as far as possible.
Yeah, so with the homes for sale in the two developments you visited, as I say, I think it doesn't reflect, I appreciate if you bring it up, but my answer would be that it doesn't reflect actually the demographics of the full population of residents who have bought those homes. That there's an issue generally with if you're selling homes for a particular price point, what are the demographics of people within that income bracket within London, which has been a big part of the racial disproportionality of housing policy in the past. And there's also the extent to which these properties can be marketed effectively to all the different people in the area, but there's absolutely no bias in the allocation of those in the sales process to then, if you're mates with somebody, it doesn't give you any more points in the way in which residents are scored in then being able to access those homes.
Thank you. Can I just ask the other three to answer, then you can come in, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have a certain point about the perception of housing co-ops and maybe CLTs, I don't know, and that it can lean towards white middle-class people. And I think historically there has been an element of that. I mean, that historically is partly maybe reflects who set up co-ops in the first place. And I joined my housing co-op in 2007, and I think you can see how the housing crisis has impacted allocations and impacted just homes and families. Because at that time, the majority of children of housing co-op members, once they become adults, left to live elsewhere or get their own home. I would say the majority now become members of the co-op democratically, but they've grown up in the co-op. They become members, and then they may want homes, and that has raised a whole new policy issue we have to deal with in housing co-ops. So things have changed, and also housing co-ops are such a small sector. There's obviously pressures there from the start. I think, for example, where I live, not too far from here in Forest Gate, it is diverse and it's very reflective of the local community, and that's a community that's obviously changed dramatically over the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, there's people like me from an Irish background who've been there for a long time, and then there's obviously new immigrants and new different people from different backgrounds have moved into the area, and it's very diverse now. And I think our management committee, for example, would really reflect that. So in that sense, it's been a success. And I would say it's not overwhelmingly middle class either at all where I live. Now that's not to say it's not patchy and different in different areas. But I think that as far as the allocations process is concerned, we have to do everything all the time to be transparent and above board. And there is a certain amount of people who know other people and can tell them about places that have come up. In a sense, you can't do much about that, but you have to make sure that we advertise ourselves, and you have to make sure there's proper process in the allocations. And one of the ways that is done, for example, in my housing co-op, we have a managing agent, which began as a co-op itself, which helps out with a lot of our administrative work and covering rents and so on. But they play a process independently and objectively in the allocations process to make sure it's not just a group of friends bringing another friend into the housing co-op, which in the longer term would be disastrous for co-ops, because we need fresh blood and people who genuinely want to run co-ops and help in that process, or the thing can't continue.
Thank you. Bernadette?
Thank you, Chair. To clarify, I'm here because I attended the Planning and Regen Committee under the Meridian Housing Start Hat, and as part of that conversation, when we're looking at housing, I'm saying how the housing provision is, there are segments within it, and we shouldn't just be looking at private sector, there's these other segments, and I mentioned the CLT, and here I am. So I'm here really with the local authority background, but I have been chair of RUS, which was the site visit that you have had. So I think I can look at this pretty much in the round. I think to your specific point, I think it's a point well made. I know from my local authority experience that there have been organisations that have been predominantly white middle class, but as Niall says, there has been an evolution and a development of their thinking and their policies to make sure they are more representative. However, I think there is a need for greater transparency because from a local authority point of view, they are the strategic housing authority. They have a duty to deal with people in housing need, homelessness people, temporary accommodation pressures. So there's a real pressure on local authorities to get the best they can out of their pipeline, out of their funding routes, and their work with partners, whether they be private sector or registered providers or whomsoever. CLTs and co-ops, Tom may want to argue about scaling them up, but they're never going to be a major provider, and I think that we probably agree with that. So I think it's worth putting on the table, but it's how do we maximise that provision in a way that meets the requirements of the local area in terms of need and strategic requirements. And I think that is a challenge, because in a lot of these organisations, and I use Russ as an example, I was at the launch, the stakeholder launch on Saturday, and Lev was there and Tom Copley was there, and it was a fabulous occasion. It was very passionate. People really cared about their environment and their contributions to it. But if you look at it, that has a long trajectory. It started, and I'm sure you heard about 15 years in the kitchen table. But other organisations will have similar stories. So these communities have been involved and invested their time, their energy into this product. So when it comes up, then obviously they feel an ownership of it. From a local authority point of view, they're looking to allocate at the point of completion and handover. They don't have that tail. They're looking at addressing the need at that time. So I think there's a conversation that needs to be had, which says, how does the local authority ensure that its strategic needs are being met, but also recognise that the special environment which CLTs and co-ops offer can happily sit side by side with that. And I think some authorities do that better than others. Not all authorities will be that interested in co-ops and CLTs. So the focus on that, I mean, I was talking to Lev at the weekend, and he was giving me an example of a local authority in London that have worked quite successfully in terms of allocations, and he might want to talk about that later. But I don't think we can really walk away from the fact that there's a series of dilemmas here about how is public sector land, money and allocations, which is a resource as well, used to ensure the greater housing need is met. And I think there's a way to go, and I think that it's good to have the conversation and how that can be met going forward.
Thank you. And then finally, Fatimatu, before I hand over to Assemblymember Boff.
First of all, thank you for that question. I would say that question is essentially the catalyst of the formation and inception of Gida Housing Co-operative, and that is the key aim that we aim to address. So in terms of the structure of the Gida Housing Co-operative, the architecture is hardwired to ensure that this is addressed. So at the moment, we have partners like Road and Bahay Kobu, and it's Filipino community-led, and the other one was South American. And we have a lot of black and ethnically minoritized members within our management committee already. And the way we market is we use our websites. So because Road and Bayakobu are established organizations, and also we have some partnership with Obele, who work with black and ethnically minoritized communities, through marketing in that way, it ensures that the people who hear about it are our target demographic, and that it meets the need of the local authority, our local area. In terms of Tottenham, we have a lot of ethnically minoritized communities, and our housing policy ensures that you're within the area, whether you work or live within Tottenham. So you can't just come from anywhere and be allocated a home, but you do have to meet these specific criteria, and the marketing ensures that it meets you where you're at in terms of the ethnic minorities.
Thank you. Assemblymember Boff.
I've got some issues with words, defining them, really. One is middle class. I don't know what that means.
I'm happy to retract that. Maybe I should have said upper and middle income.
Oh,
I was
upper
talking about
middle
income
income. Well,
brackets.
that's a whole different thing, because
I think that's all it means to
I
me.
think the housing pressures in London are such that the middle classes are feeling stressed, so. Can I ask, perhaps, Mr. Chance, the diversity of tenancies and involvement in CLTs would include middle-class people, presumably?
Yes, both being housed and being actively involved in trying to meet the needs of their community.
Absolutely. Also, the other word I'm having problems with is transparency. What do we mean by transparency? I mean, for example, if I were to ask a community land trust or a co-op what its housing allocation policy was, would that be produced, or is that, or does it genuinely, is that allocations policy completely opaque and known to no one?
For our part, we would encourage CLTs to be held to the same standards as any other registered provider of housing, and so their policies are public, they're often regulated by the regulator of social housing, they have the same level of transparency as other housing providers.
And same for co-ops, is it?
Yeah, it's the same, and also most of our housing co-ops still have websites where it'll explain the allocations policy.
Yeah.
And then if people ask to go on the waiting list, we will contact them and talk to them, explain how the process works.
Right. And Ms. Mohamed, actually you kind of already addressed it to say that there is a very public face to your allocations policy.
Yes. Though we are in our infancy, so not all of our policies has been finalised, and we, in that development, we are ensuring that we get insights from the community and what is really needed to make sure that it is.
So your intention is to make sure that that's a very transparent process.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Over to me now. I'd like to move away from issues around allocations, interesting as they are, and ask a bit about tenure, which I think Fatimatu touched on a tiny bit at the beginning, and then a bit about supply. And maybe I'll start at this end and then work along and see who'd like to join in, but I'm going to pick on you first, Tom, if that's okay. How can the CLT and cooperative sector support the provision of a range of different housing tenures which reflect London's housing needs? Or do you just think the situation in London is so difficult because of land costs, etc., or build costs, that it's not possible to support that full range of tenures?
I suppose I'd say it has been meeting the full range of tenures, although not in line with need, which is an issue that CLTs have in common with housing associations and local authorities, is the difficulty of trying to build social rent properties, particularly in London. I think also there's something about the bringing different voices into the decisions around tenures and needs that are not being met by the mainstream system, and many of the CLTs have come out of those sorts of community campaigns. So, Gida is a good example of that, of feeling that a need was not being met by mainstream providers within that community, and then giving them the voice to be able to push and promote that. London CLT similarly, which came out of the Citizens Network, and a desire to build up wealth and ownership among lower income communities that are part of the Citizens Network. So I think there's a really positive value there in bringing forward a more diverse range of tenure options and thinking about affordability and giving citizens the ability to do that. As to whether they can achieve it or not, it's just blunt viability, isn't it? And there's nothing different about a CLT or a co-op to anybody else in trying to then make that square it.
No, well, we've got the Deputy Mayor and various people from the GLA coming in later, so we will also be putting these points to them. Niall, I don't know whether you want to add anything to what Tom has just said about, the ability to, provide that full range of tenures and meeting the cross-section of need.
Well, housing co-ops have been in existence for a few decades, and it is, in the widest sense, the definition of a housing co-op, it is very wide. Different types of tenures and different types of co-ops. So you've got anything from ownership housing co-ops to tenant management organisations, co-housing, community land trusts in the broad scale, community self-build, mutual home ownership, mutual housing association. So it's quite broad. Maybe the main difference in practice is some of them you have to put some money in, have to have a stake, and others you don't. And then there's also the type of tenancy you have as well. A lot of the time it's just a basic housing tenancy. I mean, for example, my housing co-op, when you join, once you become a member, you have a £1 share, and that gives you, full voting rights inside the housing co-op. It doesn't mean you've got financial, responsibility individually if anything goes bad, but it also means, of course, if you leave the co-op, you give your share back again. So that's how a fully mutual would work, and that's the sort of traditional model that was used in housing co-ops. The drawback with that is the actual tenancy itself is not as secure as you would find in local authorities or council housing, and that's one of the things we think needs to be changed. There needs to be parliamentary legislation to change that, as it has been done in many European countries. But apart from that, it also means, of course, people can join a housing co-op without having to have a stake and have funds up front, which makes it much more open to working people, and particularly in the housing crisis at the moment.
I used to be a member of a housing co-op myself and paid the £1 for the share, and then I went to work for it, and everybody who'd paid the £1 share could be on the interview panel. So it was a very large interview panel, because it was the entire housing cooperative. I'm not necessarily... Actually, the only thing I can think of that is similar to that is political interviews, where you're interviewed by, everybody who lives in a particular area. But it's a slightly scary thought. I had about 150 people on the interview panel. I got the job, actually, so I must have done something all right.
Ultra-democratic,
Bernadette, I don't know whether you want to add anything further to what Tom and Niall have said in terms of the, tenure and the ability to meet need across the board.
Yes, if I may just add a few points. I think that viability is key to the tenure. Where the land's coming from, where the funding's coming from, and that will often determine the models which are viable for the organisation to deliver. Also around the management of the stock that's come out where it's tenanted. So I think it does come back, and it's true actually for all the sorts of housing that we talked about last committee and here. It is around viability, land and so on, and the question is where are you best placed to put that funding. And CLTs, certainly co-ops, offer a different experience which meet the needs of particular communities. And so that, how do you bring those things together to make sure that delivering quality long term and affordability and accessibility?
Fatimatu, I don't know whether you want to add anything further to the comments from the others.
Aside from I agree with almost everything that I heard, I would say that we have experienced issues in terms of the financial viability that you just mentioned, the grant levels that is allocated for housing cooperatives. And as we know, London is a very competitive market. So for a small cooperative like us, we are unable to compete in the open market. And it does impact the tenancy and the viabilities and the options that we have in hand. And in regards to even acquiring land from the local authority tends to be an issue, because for the local authority, they perceive it as that will be impacting on their projects and in terms of them meeting their the requirements that is put upon them. So it's about finding a way of there being both council housing and community-led homes, and having that devolved responsibility and the tenants being able to have control over it in terms of the 10 years and things of that nature. Yeah, that's about it. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think the points that you're making are interesting. I represent Merton and Wandsworth, and in Wandsworth we have quite a number of what are effectively tenant management cooperatives on the council's estates, and in some areas people really like that and they get very involved, and it's quite thriving, and in other blocks or estates it's people are not really as involved and not really as committed to the model of involvement. But that's a whole question about how do you put people more involved in housing cooperatives, which is not on my list of areas to cover, so I'm not allowed to ask you about that. But I am going to ask you about housing supply, and actually maybe I'll start with you, Fatimatu, and then come back to Tom. We are touching on the very first thing that Tom said right at the top when Assemblymember Mohamed first started the questioning, which is this issue about finance and viability. To what extent if there was that support there in the right way, do you think the CLT and housing cooperative model has the potential to make a significant difference to London's housing supply and indeed to affordability in London?
I would say it can impact it massively. I think there's been examples in Germany where they have used cooperatives and it's been widely successful. I do not know too much about everywhere else, but I have seen some reports. So I don't know exactly to what extent it would be, but there are a few examples around the world of different countries that has implemented it and it's been successful. So perhaps it might be us looking at where we are currently and how they were able to achieve this success and seeing what we could adopt to that. But I'm not sure in terms of the wider.
Okay, I'll move on to Bernadette. I believe, as well as Germany, that the Netherlands also have some interesting international models. But, you know, what do you think is the potential here if there was that support that we've just referred to?
Yeah, I mean, I think what underneath the proposition is actually a changed way of looking at the housing market.
Yes.
And how we bring CLTs helps a more mainstream into that. And that's a long way from where we are because of the funding programs and the way it works. And these other countries, I mean, I've actually visited some. It's not just the estate or the housing, it's actually a whole way of living and managing, and it doesn't happen overnight. And some of the CLTs, I know with the Russ one, they're actually trying to adopt that type of approach. How that might scale up is a question, and I know that lots of lessons have been learned, so hopefully next time it won't take so long and it won't be so difficult, and those lessons can be brought in to the mainline discussion. But I think to do what others are doing, they didn't do it overnight, it was long term, there was a political support for that, and it changed the way the funding worked and other structures. So I think we're way off that, and if that is a model that, you know, collectively was adopted, I think there'd be lots of infrastructure changes to allow it. But as can be seen in other countries, you know, they can offer a much greater contribution. But it's not something you could just sort of put a switch on. You know, you can't say, well, it's a committee report and we agree to do it. There's a whole system behind it that supports it and sustains it going forward. So, yes, you know, it's certainly something that perhaps if you feel you need to look at, but I don't think it's something that would happen overnight. It would need certainly systemic change to the way for housing provision.
So, Niall, you'd already referred to the need to change legislation in your previous answer. I mean, what do you think the potential is, and how would you see it being realised?
Yeah, the Confederation of Cooperative Housing, which is like the national trade body, they produced a manifesto before the election to present to the political parties and get their opinions. And I think the main issues or solutions they put forward, we in the Federation in London would agree with them. And I think the key ones are, for example, amending the Localism Act to create a presumption in favour of disposing public land and building cooperatives, which give an opportunity for cooperative movement to develop homes. Now that's quite common in lots of European countries already. And also the idea of investing in a financial intermediary to provide access to low-cost capital finance for cooperative housing organisations, which are currently priced out by the market at the present time, and also amend the right to manage regulations to include not just housing associations as well as local authorities, which could mean a massive expansion potentially of housing co-ops. I mean, the rider qualification I would add to that, of course, is we're no way, in the housing co-op movement, we don't pose these things in any way as a competition or alternative to other types of social housing and council house building, which we think is essential as well. What we think is trying to bring the best of the housing co-op movement to, for example, housing associations, and there's a lot of problems there with housing associations at the present time, and one of them is the feeling of lack of democracy a lack of participation and control.
Or perhaps even distance from the people that they've housing after they've gone through mega mergers and they now operate from, the Arctic to the Antarctic, practically. And some of them treat their tenants as if they'd like them to live in the Arctic and the Antarctic, as far as I can figure out from people approaching us with questions about, never being able to get through on the phone or speak to anybody. I mean, it seems quite... Maybe they're right for the right to manage to be applied to them.
I think they are. I mean, my other hat as chair of Social Housing Action Campaign. We're involved in this all the time. And service charges, the sense of no control or being listened to, repairs, maintenance, damp, mould. These are huge issues, obviously. I'm not saying housing co-ops are perfect on a much smaller model, but generally speaking, housing co-ops which run well have the highest satisfaction rates of all types of social housing. And I think that's because people feel that their repairs and maintenance, including cyclical maintenance, is all done, generally speaking, in good time. But the important thing is they have a direct impact on this. They democratically decide at general meetings the costs, the budgets, even setting our rents. And if some of that element of democracy for tenants and residents can be brought into housing associations, I think it would be a massive change.
I think it'd be quite revolutionary to apply democracy to most housing associations. I mean, I sort of made you laugh a bit when I sort of talked about going through this interview process and being recruited by, but it was incredibly democratic. Anybody from the housing cooperative who wanted to be on the interview panel and participate in the interview. Now, you might say that's an extreme version of democracy, but I think having that input can be quite transformative for the people that live there.
It can be, and of course it depends on the size of the co-op. Some housing co-ops are very small, it's like basically one shared house. My housing co-op's about 60, we've got 68 units, homes, so it's not practical obviously for everybody to be there and involved in that process, but we have elected bodies, a management committee, which is sub bodies, and also we have, all co-ops have regular general meetings, and the management committee would meet more regular than that. I mean, in that sense it's a real model, I think, for how housing associations could be, and also a bit of an indication of how they've moved away from their original mission and what they're meant to stand for.
Oh, it's very tempting also to go off in the direction of talking about housing associations, but I won't. I'm going to see if Tom would like to add anything to the thoughts that we've developed so far in terms of the potential for a bigger impact on housing supply by housing cooperatives and CLTs.
Yes, thank you. So one point, just also go back to the point about tenure, is to not lose the homes that you've built, and it's worth remembering that CLT and co-op homes can't be sold under the right to buy. They're protected from leasehold enfranchisement.
I mean, I think that has an attraction, I think, particularly where some of the housing associations have been offering up right to buy.
Yeah, and effectively even say a council could build homes on a CLT land, and that would then find a way of insulating council-built homes from the right to buy. So there's good reasons to do it if you want them to stay affordable. It's interesting you visited Russ and London CLT's schemes in Sydenham, and they're absolutely brilliant. They represent really those desires that Niall is describing, finding their way into a little niche, which is the only opportunity they've had. And so one of the reasons, going back to the point about diversity, is in a system which gives you no agency and no option to be involved in housing development or housing management, you find these little niches that then are very demanding on the people who try to pursue those paths. And if you look in other parts of the country or other parts of the world where public authorities are actually saying, this is valuable and we're going to facilitate it, you get a very different sort of character of developments coming through, often picking up on a lot of the sorts of things that London CLT and Russ are wanting to do. Where we've seen scale in other parts of the country, for example, CLTs in the rural southwest have led to a very significant uptick in supply, and just this week the Devon Housing Commission produced a report. All the councils in Devon have collectively commissioned work to say how can we scale up CLTs, because this has proven to be a very popular way to meet housing need in sensitive landscapes. Communities coming forward saying we want housing, we want to see stuff built. If you look internationally, and so Germany was mentioned, for example, if you look in some places like Vienna or Zurich, cooperative housing is just what housing associations do here. The difference is just governance, that they think that it's right that social tenants have the option of self-governing rather than being governed by a board of people who aren't elected by them or over whom they have no accountability. So a very simple way to scale community-led housing in the UK could simply be to say, we want to give communities and tenants power over their own homes, and there you go, it becomes the largest affordable housing providing segment in the country. I'm not necessarily suggesting you go that far, but a much smaller version of that is, in fact, exactly what happened with Gida, where you say a proportion of larger sites being developed should be given to community-led housing organisations, and land should be put into community land trusts, and communities should have agency in the way in which those sites are being developed. And there are examples of that up and down the country, and you've got St Anne's in Haringey and St Clement's in East London, where the GLA played a role in doing that. And I think the interesting thing for you to bear in mind in terms of supply is the additionality you then get by doing that, not just in terms of more empowered communities. There's a lot of academic evidence around better social cohesion and health outcomes by people having that participation and ownership in the process, but also actually additional homes. So in both St Clement's and St Anne's, community land trust-led campaigns led to a higher density of housing than would have been there otherwise, led to a much higher proportion of affordable housing than would have been there otherwise. In the St Anne's case, it more than doubled the number of homes from a previous private sector-led proposal for that site. Communities are willing to have more homes built if they feel that they have the benefits of it. And so for me, community-led housing is a very powerful way to do that. Similar with Russ, I mean, Lewisham Council at the time said that their alternative to selling it to Russ would have been to just auction it, and their expectation was you would have got 4 or 5 executive homes on that site. Instead, you got 36 affordable homes with a variety of tenures. So I think the way to think about scaling this is not to think how do we help many more communities to struggle along as Russ has tried to do, but how do we give communities agency in the way that the housing system is working in London and give them and structure those opportunities in. And when you do it, it's no faster or slower, it's no more expensive or difficult than any other form of development, but it's just a changing nature of the role of community.
Okay, so a lot of things there about changing our headspace, but also some a way of dramatically making it all happen overnight, despite what Bernadette was saying. But it does take that change in the headspace. Can I just ask you finally, moving away from the sort of more mainstream provision, obviously there are issues generally, which we have looked at in this committee last year, in terms of specialist and supported housing. In the past, this cooperative housing has been used to provide supportive communities for groups of people. Is this an area that you think the model is now suited to in the changed environment that we find ourselves in? And I'll start with Tom and then see if anyone else wants to come in.
I think there's lots of underexplored potential. So in London, you've got things like older women's co-housing. In Barnet, looking at alternative forms of mutual support for women over the age of 50, or Heads Together, which is a co-op trying to provide homes for parents who are in temporary accommodation, single parents in temporary accommodation, who want a different sort of form of living together. These things do exist, but they're again slightly in the margins, and there's a lot more potential. I know in other parts of the country, people have been very interested in, for example, housing solutions with people with very severe cases of autism or other needs. I think there's a lot, there's a little, but there's much less than we would like in then exploring, again, these questions of what kind of agency and new forms of provision you could bring out through this. Maybe in the co-op, Niall might know for the co-op sector, it's a more significant thing.
Do you want to add anything, anyone else, Niall?
Yeah, I think historically lots of, quite a few housing co-ops are set up for specific different groups who wanted to live together. And sometimes that worked out, sometimes it didn't, but that's historically how it evolved. And I think there's still an appetite for that, but I would say the main issue is just the housing crisis full stop. I mean, one of the big, as I said previously, one of the big changes for me since I've been in a housing co-op in 2007 is the adult children are staying put. And that brings, of course, big pressures onto households, and it raises the question of can they then move internally within the co-op and get a property within the co-op, and the jury's out on that actually, and we have to get advice on that because there's not really been an issue with housing co-ops before. What we'd like to do, of course, is expand the housing co-op sector massively, and one of the problems we have is that a lot of housing co-ops in London have come of age and all the mortgages are paid off. For example, my housing co-op, we paid off our last mortgage last year, so we're asset rich, but not asset rich enough to start building loads of co-op housing, new housing, even in Newham. So there is a problem, so we do need to unlock that with, I think, a change in legislation. As far as that's concerned. But within that, we've had a lot of discussion in the last few months in the London Federation and with other bodies like the CCH about what are the possibilities of using the resources we have. So, for example, of establishing perhaps a secondary co-op in different parts of London where we pool together our resources for maintenance, repairs, office workers, so we're not all duplicating the same work, and we might only live apart half a mile.
Don't like to say that you're reinventing the wheel, but didn't there used to be Chisel and Axel and all of these secondary housing, Chisel cooperative housing in South East London? I can't remember what Axel stood for. I think they just called themselves Axel to differentiate themselves from Chisel.
Yeah,
but they were all existed for...
They did, and without naming names, I think there's a bit like housing associations. There's been a bit of a departure from the original missions, if you like. And
Solon, I think, was a secretary for several housing cooperatives at one point before it. I think it's probably part of L&Q now. Yeah,
and most of those secondary housing co-ops don't function as co-ops. They're not democratically run. They're appointed bodies with CEOs. Well,
they might be now, but that's not how they used to be workers. They used to be workers cooperatives, most of them as well.
Yeah, and we need to try and get back to that model. And I think the way things have evolved has led to a number of housing cooperatives feeling that there's too much of a distance with these bodies and they're not getting the service that they would like. And that is, it's openly discussed and within, it's not news to anybody in the housing co-op movement, so other things are being looked at. And within that, we do have a lot of resources. As I said, a lot of housing co-ops own their own properties now, and these are in some of the most enviable parts of London. They weren't when the housing co-ops were set up, but they are now, and we've got to try and make the best of that in a way for our own members to keep their security of homes, but also to expand co-ops, even to the point where we don't want to coerce anybody out of their home, especially if they've brought families up. But obviously there's a whole issue of over-occupation and then younger families needing somewhere to live within a co-op, and a way of trying to see if we can unlock that. One of the things we're discussing and looking at is even establishing a housing co-op on the coast somewhere, so people from London who get to retirement age and want to move out and are happy to do that, then it can open up the property in their co-op for someone else, for a younger family. That's the sort of range of things we can look at. But you are right, in a certain sense it is reinventing the wheel, and it's necessary.
Afraid so. I used to work for some other cooperatives, and people who worked there went off to work for Chisel and Axel and all the rest of it. But anyway, I shall leave it there, Chair. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much for your contribution so far. It's been really interesting. So I just had some short questions on the model and the scaling up aspects. So the first one is, and I know a couple of these things have been mentioned, but I just wanted to specifically ask what the key issue is holding back in the kind of scaling up and development of these kind of models. And I think, Niall, you were just touching on some of it then, but I'm really interested in the threats to the non-profit nature and the kind of core principles of these models. And I just wondered what you think could be done to kind of safeguard them from those kind of departure from their missions. If you have any comments on that, and I'll start with Fatimatu, if that's all right, and just anyone who wants to come in. Thanks.
I'll say I'm not quite adept at the technical understanding of how that could be safeguarded, but I would imagine that through the use of policies, it could be managed when it's in terms of from the local authority level, and within the cooperatives, it can be that their regulations and how they run it is hardwired from internally, but I'm honestly not sure of how that would be done in a high level.
And did you have anything on just how we scale, like one key thing that would help scale up your sort of model or replicate it? Do you have any ideas around that?
I would say that there needs to be closer relationship with local authorities pertaining to, let's say for Gida, we're quite a small and emergent organisation, and there's something about having the correct amount of funding to be able to do the things that we need to do, because we have encountered a lot of challenges pertaining to becoming a registered RP, in terms of legal support that we need, consultancies, financial accounting and things of that nature. I think there's something about supporting small organisations to even become viable, and how is that done through the local authorities? To make sure that they are set up for success, because we've seen instances where cooperatives begin, but they do not get to realise their goals because there are so many barriers coming into this housing sector, I've realised that there's so much bureaucracy that I haven't seen before, and you do need a lot of capital. And how does the local authority or GLA, how do they support those organisations to make sure that they are successful, rather than it being you have to completely do it yourself, whether you have it or not, and you're left sort of on the back foot, always defending yourself, and yeah, things of that nature.
Thank you. I think in terms of scaling up point, I think it touches on everything we talked about: funding, viability, how you get skills, how you move it forward. If we're going to move this forward and grow it, then maybe look at different models. And Tom has mentioned maybe looking at partnering and having land within a bigger provision. That would certainly, I think, deal with some of the resourcing and the skills to do that. And of course, we shouldn't lose sight of it is in perpetuity for CLTs, certainly, and that's really important. Going forward, how do you protect that? And I think the other thing is, housing associations have changed in their nature over the decades. Some of them do operate as commercial entities. So I think the landscape has changed, and if CLTs and co-ops are going to have a bigger slice of the sector, then there needs to be systemic changes to allow that to happen. Otherwise, I think it will continue as it is, and it will continue to struggle. It will take small sites. It will take a long time. And if there's a will to really change that, then I think there have to be some big decisions taken. But I do think there is a model there about partnering to open up possibilities, which at the moment may be available in small amounts, but not as a not as a routine. We've got a big site coming up. Is there any scope here for some CLT allocation of site? And again, that comes back to the politics, wherever that sits, to say, actually, this is a priority. We want to do that because it delivers these other benefits. Because although we've talked about some of the challenges, I don't think we should lose sight of the communities that are in these developments. They're passionate about them. And, I saw that firsthand at the launch. They're absolutely passionate, and they will fight for it. And so we need to not lose that in the discussion about the bigger problem of the housing crisis and how we move forward, notwithstanding the challenges that we have touched on today.
Yeah, I think people are passionate about their homes and housing co-ops, and I think it was 2016 the government brought in a housing act or housing bill, and there was a bit of a grey area in part of it. It wasn't clear if an possible extension of the right to buy was going to impact on housing co-ops, but it was enough for the biggest campaign and movement I've seen of housing co-op people for years. Overnight, hundreds were attending meetings and getting involved in it because it was an existential threat if it had taken place, because obviously some people might have been in a position to buy their own home through right to buy, but that would be just the death knell of housing co-ops. If that process was to continue, then of course it would just chip away, and it could take away, some of the people who help run co-ops, the most experienced, and so on. As it turns out, that was, I don't know really if it is included in the bill or not. It was never clear to me, but I think it was never acted on, and hopefully it never will be, because I think we need to do the opposite. As I mentioned earlier, the Confederation of Co-operative Homes put forward a manifesto for the election, and one of the key issues is the need to have a legal form of cooperative tenure and a Cooperative Housing Act, which should bring Britain a bit closer to the situation in Europe, where in most European countries such acts do exist and guarantee housing cooperatives and have loads of safeguards for them and put their tenure of their tenants on the same level as we'd have here in council housing or local authority housing. Those are some basic things that need to be done to ensure that housing co-ops can continue. And people mentioned, I think it was Berlin earlier. I've got some of the statistics on it here. Housing co-ops own about 200,000 apartments in Berlin, and there's about 100 co-ops which make up 12% of Berlin's rented housing. So it is a huge sector. It's not exactly the same model as ours. I think very often in many Scandinavian countries as well, you have to put some money in to become a member of a housing co-op, which generally speaking isn't how it's done traditionally in housing co-ops in Britain. But nevertheless, it's a big sector. It's a big part of the housing co-op sector that there's no reason why that can't be emulated here. It's a matter of political will and policy. And I think this is the opportunity to do it. There's a new government in which says it wants to increase the cooperative sector, I think, by 2 or 3 times the size it is now. And of course, the cooperative sector isn't just the shops and retail, it is the housing sector, which historically, compared to most of Europe, has been small. And there's all sort of historical reasons for that. Partly is because council housing was so big in the past. But I think both need to be looked at. We need more council homes, but we also need more tenants' democracy, an encouragement of tenants to be organised and to have their own voice, particularly in the housing association sector. And as part of that process, I think we need a government to be encouraging housing co-ops.
Thanks. So two thoughts, again running with the international comparisons. So I'd encourage the committee to look at Barcelona, which has a programme to develop 1,000 cooperative and community-led homes in quite a short space of time. And the approach they've taken, the differences there to London, are quite instructive. So first of all, they don't go through complicated procurement processes to try and determine who land goes to. All the land's going into a community land trust for the city. That safeguards against the future, because they're now asset locked. They have to be held for the benefit of the people of Barcelona. Each different site is being developed by 2 main developing bodies and some financial structures, with then people forming different sorts of housing co-ops to then lease those sites from the CLT. Real variety, a bit like with Gida, different community groups who feel that they haven't got an access. So there's an LGBT co-op, there's particular minorities and other sort of ways of wanting to live together, and then they work with those same developers to build those things out. And so the ask of citizens isn't, can you form a group, put together an architectural proposal, somehow raise £200,000 of pre-development finance off your own backs, etc., which is the sort of opposite, the offer that's been given to communities in London. The offer is, here's a pathway to develop your own housing with the finance and the development capability lined up. Now, Barcelona is obviously slightly different to London because you haven't got 32 Barcelona boroughs. And what we have in London instead is each borough forcing communities to go through complicated and expensive procurement processes which are unnecessary, to undertake years of expensive legal negotiations over leases and other things which the GLA set up a small sites programme precisely to fix. You could do a lot to streamline the way that small sites come through and develop a cadre of a small number of developers able to work with communities to build out schemes. You've already got a couple that have been successfully doing that in recent years, and that would really enable the growth of the development of community-led approaches on smaller sites. The other, as we talked about, is allocations in bigger sites. Just say, as is happening with self and custom build, there's an expectation that 5% of large sites go into community hands. And that's not just housing, that can be other assets as well. So in East Cambridgeshire, there's a district council there that's very, very pro-community-led development, and there's a 500-home garden village coming forward, where a third of the affordable homes, all of the open space and all of the civic amenities go into a community land trust. So instead of putting these things into private, unaccountable management structures, give the opportunity for assets to be put into community hands. Other CLTs in London are also, like the East End Trades Guild, trying to ensure that there's access to workspace, all the issues with the lack of, the loss of railway arches and MOT garages, all those other things can come into the mix. And communities can see that if we accept redevelopment into our area, we're going to get assets out of it which are in our hands as a proportion of what's being built. So just, a policy requirement like that in London could be quite transformative in the opportunities it would create for communities to have more, more assets, and if this become a bigger part of the picture.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start with. Yes, I'm going to come to Bernadette and Tom first. Look, one of the biggest issues here is land acquisition. It's often cited as the biggest barrier to community groups, moving forward with development. What support do community groups need in order to acquire land?
So it goes back to my comments about Barcelona. It depends how you're doing it. At the moment, the support they need is grant funding through something like the Community Housing Fund for the legal and technical advice to negotiate with the council or whoever's leasing them or selling the land, and do all the feasibility work to figure out what you can afford to pay for it and what you're going to develop on it. And in the absence of something like the Community Housing Fund, communities aren't capitalised in the way that a large housing association or developer is to be able to do all that early work. So you need something like the Community Housing Fund for communities to be able to do that work and bring those things forward. Alternatively, you offer sites through, you take the Barcelona method or you take the St Anne's approach, and then communities don't need a great deal of support to do that at all because they're kind of not involved in all of the complex negotiations over it. The land has been allocated and it's been identified and decided that it's going to go into community hands, and what they need to be supported with is establishing a viable co-op and getting your policies and procedures in place and deciding who you're allocating homes to and all those other things.
Okay. But Bernadette, so let me just slightly tweak the question because I think Tom's given quite a full answer. With your local authority experience, what would be the challenges in the local authority providing that kind of help? So local authority, London level, what sort of scale would the mayor need to put aside to provide that pre-funding so it could do pre-apps, etc. And what kind of challenge would it be to the local authority to provide that land? Why would they do it, or why wouldn't they want to do that?
Well, that's quite a question. Each local authority should know sometimes, still looking at what their land bank is. Yeah. And then they decide how the best use of that. And that goes through the whole planning process. What tends to happen for CLTs, co-ops, and indeed small housing providers is you tend to get the rump of the sites. Yes. Yeah. So they tend to be the smaller sites, the more difficult sites, the ones that other people don't want to use, can't use, and they're given that as the opportunity to build something out. All right? And then you hit all the issues that Tom has talked about the funding, the resourcing, the professionalism, etc. However, within that land of the local authority, there will be large sites which they'll be looking at for bigger developments, private sector, maybe large housing associations. And I think that's what Tom is suggesting, is that when they're looking at those sites, could there be the opportunity for the local authority to say, if we have a site, say, of site X, we would like to see this amount allocated to a CLT. Now, it would have to be a political priority to do that. Yeah. And then, if they work really under the umbrella of a larger developer, it takes away some of the challenges that they currently face, which then reduces the need for some of the funding to get CLT development off the ground. So I think there's a way that local authorities decide to allocate land. The funding, then I think the mayor, if this is a way that the GLA want to go, is to see how can they use the current funding routes and how might they be able to extend them and use them in a way to say to local authorities, we think this is a good idea because of all the reasons we've touched on here, and there is this funding specifically if you will progress with those schemes and access the funding to do it, we will help you. So it will be a partnership on the funding side, but what you're really trying to do on the output side is get some CLT cooperative development, which otherwise wouldn't happen. And they'd still be struggling for the small sites, the difficult sites. And that's why I was saying that this isn't going to happen overnight. It needs to be a systemic change if we're going to see the CLT and cooperatives grow because of the way the funding and the processes currently work.
Okay, I think I'm building a picture in my mind. I'm going to come to Fatimatu and Niall as well and ask, is there any provision for you to develop a site? Do you feel that there's any help provided? To what extent are local community groups supported by local councils and the GLA through the planning process? Do you think there's anything there for you?
Yeah, it's a good question, and leading up to this meeting I just asked around some of the different people in co-ops that I work with, and the anecdotal, at least, replies are that it's not very helpful. And for example, the Mayor's Community Housing Fund, I mean, a lot of co-ops haven't even heard of it, and those that have find that it's a very bureaucratic process, that they get the impression that housing co-ops aren't particularly regarded or welcomed as part of that process, and also that very often it's a competitive process, so you need time to maybe go through 2 or 3 bids before you're skilled up enough to know how to approach it the next time and maybe get some funding. So I think most housing co-ops just find it difficult and laborious, and already existing housing co-ops, there can be a conservative tendency amongst members, understandably, because they've weathered the storm for decades, keeping co-ops going when the political climate wasn't friendly very often, and then they own their properties, and it can be quite a job for some of us who want to expand co-ops to say, let's use all our assets to develop co-ops, and their approach can understandably be, well, let's just hold on to what we've got. So it has to be something that's seen as practical, not a very complicated bureaucratic process, and it can expand the housing co-op and help develop other ones, because otherwise it's just a potted, very patchy picture. For example, I know a housing co-op in Islington, and they own all their properties. Several years ago they wanted to expand. They couldn't do it in Islington. Even with all the assets they had, it was just too expensive, too complicated. So what they ended up doing was just buying a property in East Town, miles away, as part of their housing co-op. You know, it's miles away in a different part of the city, and that's obviously not a solution. So I mean, certainly the community housing fund needs to be looked at, in my opinion. You know, I don't think it's really working for housing co-ops. I don't know what the experience of CLTs and other bodies has been with it, but it isn't really working for us. And I think, as well as all the points that have been made by Bernadette, I think you know, the other thing is we need to return to some ways of the grants that were there in the 70s and 80s, which really did make a big difference and got housing co-ops off the ground. I mean, the situation was different because big parts of inner city London, no one really wanted to live in them.
Yeah,
so they were glad when people maybe, you know, started to squat and they said, well, we'll come to an arrangement with you and you can turn this into something livable, and we'll give you a grant towards it. We'll give you good preferential terms for mortgages over a long period of time. And that was done. But why can't that be done again and looked at? Because at the end of the day, what that did, it created local communities and people who have stayed there for generations. And so there's a stability, there's a local community that obviously has a good impact on the local economy as well. And it means that 2 or 3 generations are growing up in those housing co-ops. It's much more stable and much more genuine local community than you get in many inner city parts of London now, as we know, because of the pressures of the housing crisis and people coming and going and so on. So I think it is a good model to follow. We should look back at what was successful in the 70s and 80s to establish housing co-ops.
Okay, Fatimatu, anything to add?
I think it would be a great thing if the local authorities can look at housing cooperatives being able to manage the properties without ownership and buying the properties outright, because we had a situation where we made an offer that we can manage the properties without buying it, and perhaps the local authority can be a registered RP, and that was completely shut down. So we have been put in a position where we're forced to acquire more money in order to purchase the property so that we can have management rights. And in regards to the selection process, it seems as though that there are instances where it's very slow in terms of the selection process. So we applied, well, to be honest, the application process was open very late in the game, where the design and the architecture was all pretty much done, and we had no say in what size of the properties are. For instance, I have 3 kids, and the properties that are being built are pretty much 1 to 2 bedroom house, and there's about 3 bedroom spaces. So essentially we had no say in what was being done. So you're being given properties that you have no say. And in our housing survey, there is a large proportion of people within Tottenham that needed larger homes. And once 3 bedroom and above properties are out, even private renting, where it's extremely high, it's gone within less than a week because I've been looking for homes. And every time I call, in that same day, it's gone by the end of the day because people are completely desperate, even without viewing the properties. So there's something about why is it that these private companies are being permitted to build houses that are 1 to 2 bedrooms. Yes, it benefits them financially and they can sell it quicker, but the community needs more than that. And how is that being addressed and make sure that they meet the needs of all members of the communities rather than specific portion?
Go ahead, Bernadette.
Yeah, I mean, that point, I think, was touched at the other committee, where the 1.5 million homes, you know, great number, great target, but what type of homes? Who's providing them? What's their tenure? Are they the housing in the right place at the right size, tackling the housing issues? And so we don't collectively want to lose the opportunity of making sure that that build programme picks up all those other requirements, and it isn't just focused on tall 1, 2 bed blocks to get the numbers. And then, you know, that's a conversation that really does need to happen. I just wanted to come back because, you know, now I was talking about the Halcyon Days of Hag, HOD, Housing Association Grant, and Solon and Chisel, and
you've forgotten Mini Hag as well.
Oh, indeed. But I think it also needs to be stated, at that time, local authorities had people with the skills and the knowledge of those sectors and the complexities and the values and all of that. And over time, they have been, you know, they're dissipated, they're not there now. So it isn't just about the getting the funding streams. You've got to have people on all sides of the table understanding what you're seeking to achieve, not losing that broader strategic requirement of providing housing. And there has been a loss of those skills within the sector, I would suggest.
Thank you. In benefit of time, we're up against time, so I'm going to quickly ask Tom one small question finished. But it's the time of year in City Hall where we're all about the London plan. Right. Is there any parts of the need of your sector that could be baked into the London plan?
Yes, I think so. The MPPF in December introduced a definition of community-led development, encouraged small sites to be provided for community-led development, and there's also an exception sites policy. So one would be to look at whether you could apply that exception sites policy within London, which basically says that sites that haven't been allocated for development can be developed if they're run by community groups that will be asset-locked community developments. So particularly things like the little garage back sites and so on. There's been lots of that activity around London. You could give more planning certainty around being able to do that kind of infill development by communities. The other thing would be the point about allocations within larger sites of housing and non-housing assets and strongly encouraging that through the London plan.
Chair, there's maybe 2 recommendations there. I go back to you, Chair, but I asked that question in order to generate that sort of definite what can be done in our recommendations.
Thank you very much. Before I hand over to Assembly Member Small-Edwards for the last question in this section, I just wanted to ask you, Bernadette, you talked about and to an extent, Niall, but I'm keen to hear from your local authority perspective, the issue of land receipts and kind of how that might be overcome, whether it's something in the negotiation, this adult negotiation that needs to happen, it's something which a public authority, whoever it might be, disposing of land, would forego that land receipt in exchange for something. I just wonder from your perspective what that something would be if you were to be like a garage site, handing it over to a co-op or a CLT for development, and you get 20 new homes, but no money back that you would if you were selling it on. How would that circle be squared?
Those types of deals have always been around. So there's always been the opportunity for best consideration, which isn't necessarily pound notes. It's about, numbers of units, types of units, facilities being built in. And that's a one-off negotiation on a particular site with whoever your provider is. So I wouldn't say that is necessarily contentious or new, okay? It used to be quite a common practice, but as I said, a lot of those skills have moved on. So So it would be about what the site would provide. The problem with the garage site, and I take your point totally, Tom, but, you know, they had to come with a whole heap of problems. And one of the things I always used to think about was how you can create a basket of opportunities. So not just one garage site, but actually if across a borough you've got 10 garage sites which are problematic, can you put them into one basket and offer them out? And you know, I can recall being party to arrangements when we did that with housing associations as a way of getting those sites out and getting beneficial use from them. So I think there are creative ways of how to do it. And I don't think that they're necessarily new. It's about maybe re-energising some of them and looking at it across the patch. But it's not the shortest route when there's a drive to deliver, but I don't think we should lose it because we will be losing an opportunity, I think.
Thank you. I mean, a route nonetheless, but thank you for that response. Assembly Member Small-Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Do you think that local authorities should have more of a role in supporting and, I think, crucially monitoring CLTs and housing cooperatives? And kind of, if so, what do you think that should look like? Start with Tom and go across.
I certainly think they should have, they could play more of a role in supporting them, and I think we've discussed a lot of the ways in which they could do that. And Southwark Council, for example, just recently responded to its Land Commission, which made some recommendations along those lines. And it's interesting, in the United States, where the CLT model comes from, because of the greater level of devolution in there, there's lots of good examples of local authorities or city government basically using tax incentives and land disposal and land banks and so on to do this in a very systematic way, and in that context very systematically to try to build wealth in people in communities of colour in the United States to address that particular issue they have there. So I think that is something that councils could do, and what we'd really like to see is this become a central plank in their strategy. So again, if you look at Liverpool, for example, they've really positioned this within community wealth building, and they've said, how can we, as part of a range of options for trying to redevelop the city, give people more control and enable communities to build up wealth through the way that they do things. I think in terms of monitoring, I think there's a danger of treating co-ops and CLTs and co-housing and other things differently to other forms of housing provision in a way that's kind of going too far the other. Like you don't want to under monitor it, you also don't want to over monitor it. And so the point, like Fatimatu mentioned about registered providers, if you're providing social rent housing, then by and large that will be done by registered providers, and so there is that oversight mechanism already. I think it's definitely worth local authorities asking things about governance, saying, okay, you've established a community land trust, but who are your members? How do you recruit your members? How are you governed? How do they participate in your governance? Or how are you ensuring that you're inclusive of your community? Those sorts of questions are worth asking, but I think you don't want to go over the top. Like, how much do boroughs ask these questions of housing associations or of other providers or other organisations active in their environment? You don't want to kind of put so many burdens on people that you then make it more difficult to be able to do this than other forms of development.
Just to come back on that, so say allocations in sale of CLT properties, do you think that would be an example of being too onerous, or?
I guess they should follow the same. So if you're selling a shared ownership home in London, there's procedures for that, and it should be no different for a CLT selling a shared ownership home. Similarly, if you're doing a rental home, in terms of how they're allocated and so on. I think there's room for allowing for allocations policies where groups come forward and said we're trying to meet the needs of a particular community, be it racial community or age or whatever. But I think don't treat them any differently to others in terms of the level of oversight. The one caveat to that is just to recognise that when you're very small providers, and very small housing associations have this in London as well, you're kind of thinking about what's realistic to expect of a provider with 30 homes as opposed to some of the London providers that have 30,000 or over 100,000 homes. Obviously, there needs to be proportionality about it, but the basic principles of safeguarding the public interest, I think, can be quite similar.
Thank you very much, and thank you all of you. That's been really, really fascinating, and I think you've answered a lot of questions that we had. So, yes, my formal thanks to all of you for your contributions today. We're going to take a 5-minute break to try and catch up with time in the second session. Yes, if you have any thoughts over and above what you have said today, we have our call for evidence open. You'd be really welcome to write in and share those with us to inform outputs from today.
Can I make an early bid for that if Mr. Chance could send us those recommendations that he would have for the London plan? It would be very, very helpful. For
I've been taking lots and lots of notes of things that you have said, so I will share those with the committee, and then we'll included in that will be definitely your thoughts around the London plan for the planning committee rather. But thank you very much, and we'll adjourn